This is the BBC.
Welcome to Everyday Ethics, your free weekly podcast from the BBC with me, Audrey Carville. On this week's podcast, is the spot where Moses received the Ten Commandments about to become a luxury tourist mega resort. Now, nestling at the foot of Mount Sinai in Egypt, where Moses is said to have received the Ten Commandments, sits the 6th century St. Catherine's Monastery. For centuries, pilgrims have visited the Greek Orthodox-run monastery and then ventured up the mountain to watch the sunrise over the stunning rocky landscapes. It is one of Egypt's most sacred places, and it is revered by Jews, Christians and Muslims. But now it is at the heart of an unholy row over plans by the Egyptian government to turn it into a new tourism mega project. And this project includes luxury hotels, villas and shopping bazaars. We'll hear more on that in a moment and the battle to stop it. But first, a blast from our archive from 2008 when our producer Mark McCleary trekked through the desert to visit St. Catherine's.
The Greek Orthodox monks at evening prayer, safe behind the vast walls built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian almost 1500 years ago. And unlike many monasteries, St. Catherine's is still going strong in the 21st century.
The remarkable thing is that the monastery has survived from that day to this. We know that the Persians sacked Jerusalem in 614. It wasn't worth their while to come here. When the Muslims came, when the Crusaders came, each time an invading army appeared, they supported the monastery, and as a result, the monastery has never been abandoned and never been destroyed in all of its history.
Father Justin is originally from the US, but has been here in the Egyptian desert for more than 15 years. He is also the keeper of one of its greatest treasures, and agreed to give me a tour. Behind a simple barred door is the second most important library in Christendom, with thousands of ancient manuscripts, including a copy of a letter sent by the Prophet Muhammad to the monks in the 7th century.
When Islam first began to expand, the monks appealed to Muhammad for a letter of protection. And he dictated this. Because he did not write, he would dictate the letters, and then he would place his hand on the letter as a way of giving it his authority, and the scribe would write, "I put my hand on this." The original letter was taken by Sultan Selim, who was the first Ottoman Sultan to rule Egypt in 1516, and he took it to the Topkapi, where it is preserved to this day. So the documents that you see here are copies of that document made at the time of Sultan Selim. At the bottom of this display case, we have a copy of the Gospels written in the 11th century. It is open to the beginning of the Gospel of St. Luke, and what is surprising is that instead of having St. Luke portrayed as the evangelist writing his Gospel, you have St. Luke portrayed as the iconographer, painting an icon of the Virgin and the Christ child. Our tradition is that St. Luke was both an evangelist and an iconographer, and this is one of the justifications for having icons, in that both the gospel and the icons go back to the evangelists themselves.
In a library full of treasures in many languages, the greatest is the 20 pages of the Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest surviving Bible in the world.
This is a copy of the complete scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, and originally it included two late 1st century Christian texts that were not part of the scriptures, were part of this manuscript, the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas.
The monks used to own all of the manuscript, but a lot of it was controversially removed from the monastery by a German scholar in the 19th century, and it's now split between the British Library, the State Library of St. Petersburg and the University of Leipzig. However, all is not lost, and here in the desert, Father Justin is part of a high-tech $1 million project that will make the Codex available to all.
These 4 institutions are collaborating to conserve the original pages and fragments, to photograph them with a high-resolution digital camera. We will have a website that will present all of this to the public, and we will also have a high-quality facsimile, and it will be the first time there has been a facsimile that includes all of the surviving pages and fragments of this most important manuscript.
In the library, I also met Hamid. His Bedouin tribe are descended from Byzantine soldiers sent by the emperor to protect the monastery, and although they converted to Islam hundreds of years ago, they still carry out that ancient function. They live in a village beside the monastery and work closely with the monks.
They have a good relationship, and we're trying to call the monastery the place of the peace in the world between the Muslim and the Christians.
And do all your family and friends, do they work with the monastery as well?
Most of them. My father worked in the monastery, and my cousin, and my grandfather worked more than 60 years in the monastery. So happy because I love the monastery, and I'm grown up in the monastery here. When I was a child, I was playing beside the monastery.
Leaving the library, I walk around the vast fortress-like walls just as the daily invasion of tourists arrive and the peace of the monastery is shattered. Many come for the history and the incredible art, but for some, it is also a spiritual pilgrimage. At the Chapel of the Burning Bush, where indeed a modern-day descendant of that flaming but unconsumed plant still grows, a group of Russians are having an impromptu service. Admiring the Well of Moses is a group of nuns from Mother Teresa's order who are planning to climb Mount Sinai later to watch the sunrise. And everywhere you look, there are tour groups and their leaders. No longer does it feel like a place of contemplation. The Desert Fathers believed that in their solitude, they were standing in the place of Christ for the world. Right now, it feels like the world is invading the place of Christ. I retreat to the library once more and ask Father Justin if modern tourism is perhaps the greatest threat to the way of life here.
When you see the monastery, surroundings, so much has changed in recent years. You see the modern roads, the hotels, the restaurants, all the shops, the many things that have been built to support the many visitors who come here today. When you see the inside of the monastery, then you realize that very little has changed, and most importantly, the way of life has not changed. The spiritual goals that have been here from very ancient times are still the spiritual goals that we have and that we try to maintain today.
Father Justin at St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, talking to our reporter Mark McCleary back in 2008. And listening to that report and that memorable line from Mark when he said, "It seems the world is invading the place of Christ." Let's fast forward to today and Egypt's plans to build on the site, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Dr. John Granger managed the project known as Developing the St. Catherine's Protectorate for the EU for 8 years. He also wrote the book Around the Sacred Mountain. He described for us what it was like when he first encountered it in the mid-1990s.
It was still comparatively remote, and the sense of place was still rather intact. But we were concerned as a protectorate because the protectorate covered 3,500 square kilometres or so. But the core of the area was really centred around the Mount Sinai, Gebel Musa, the monastery, and that immediate area. Our concern was not only for the conservation of the flora and fauna, but also for protecting the landscape, the vistas of the monastery, so the sense of place would remain as intact as possible. We accepted the fact there would be development, so we developed a sustainable plan for the whole of St. Catherine, which was endorsed by the Egyptian government, which meant that all new development would be away outside of the core area and to protect both the character and nature of the town as a Bedouin town, but also protect these very historical vistas of the monastery looking down onto the plain of Araha, where the Israelites are purported to have waited while Moses was up the mountain receiving the tablets of the law. The great watercolorist Roberts went there and painted the monastery looking with the background of Wadi Araha behind, clean and open and grandiose in its scale and its sense of this extraordinary place.
Most recently, in the last week or so, the BBC's Middle East correspondent Yolande Nell paid a visit to the region, and she is reporting that luxury hotels, villas and shopping bazaars are under construction there as part of this major tourism project that the Egyptian government have begun. What do you think when you hear that, John?
I've known about it since 2020 and been trying to draw the world's attention to that. This project didn't receive any endorsement from the monastery. It was presented as a fait accompli or from the local people. It's been imposed upon them. And construction started in 2021. We tried to raise the world's attention by contacting UNESCO, who are responsible for the World Heritage Sites, and also ICOMOS, the International Centre for Monuments, who are the agency responsible for cultural World Heritage Sites. But there was no response to any of our supplications to actually intervene. So a small group of us have, for the last 4 or 5 years, been desperately trying to raise attention to the fact that this huge project, which ironically is being called the Great Transfiguration Project, using a religious terminology for it, and now the Great Revelation Project. So we've been trying to raise awareness to this because this project is centered right in front of the monastery, in the front of the monastery, completely destroying this historical vista, which was meant to be protected by the state and committed to be protected, but it's also in contravention of the Egyptian government's own laws for development inside a protectorate, and also, possibly more important for the world, it's inside a World Heritage Site, and it's in direct contravention to all the commitments that the state party, which is Egypt, made at the time of the inscription of St. Catherine Area World Heritage Site in 2002.
Protections under UNESCO World Heritage Site status, are they founded in law? People will be wondering, how is this allowed to proceed if it is a World Heritage Site, which it is?
In some countries, World Heritage properties or sites are protected by law. In Britain, they're not actually. But unless a country actually has particular laws for their own World Heritage sites, they don't have any protection by law. The site is only maintained to the ability or at the behest of the state party. UNESCO can only appeal to the state party to actually adhere to its commitment to the World Heritage Convention and tries to hold it to account. But it has no authority except to possibly list the site as one of the World Heritage Sites in danger, or at the last resort, delist it from its World Heritage status.
But it won't necessarily stop this development, will it?
I think the development is too late. It's a fact of life now. It's disfigured one of the great religious spaces in the world. The sense of place, the sense of tranquility, which the area took on, especially when many of the tourists had left during the day, because many were day tourists, and a landscape which, whether this is the genuine Mount Sinai, because there are other more likely locations, but this landscape has been imbued with sanctity from centuries of pilgrimage. The area became a sort of a refuge for anchorites fleeing persecution from Egypt from the 2nd century. And they established little hermitages all around Mount Sinai. And that's why the monastery eventually was built, because they initially in the 3rd century built a tower where the hermits would come for special services, for particular religious celebrations. But if they were attacked, they could retreat into this tower. And that tower forms the central part of the present day monastery, which is essentially built as a fort by Justinian. So I think that we have to accept that this site now has been incredibly damaged. And yet, at the last meeting of the World Heritage Committee in Paris this year, in 2025, we had written as part of the World Heritage Watch, which is an NGO, to every member of the World Heritage Committee delegates, pointing out that the state party, Egypt, had been in contravention of all its commitments since 2002 by not implementing the Sustainable Town Plan, by not having a tourism management plan, and also not stopping work which was requested by UNESCO in 2023. So they could actually send a mission to the Sinai called a reactive monitoring mission to understand the nature of the project and see whether its impact on the universal values on which St. Catherine was listed as a World Heritage Site.
It is clearly a remarkably important religious, cultural and historical place. That cannot be overstated. But it is also home to the Jebeleya tribe of the Bedouin community. Are they being forced out too?
Well, I thank you for raising that. That is one of the issues. In our project, when we did that, nearly a third of our budget was actually devoted to what we call the Bedouin Development Program, which empowered the Bedouin, because the Bedouin, the Jebeleya, means the people of the mountain, who are the descendants of the builders and the mercenary soldiers who were sent down by Justinian in the 6th century to build and guard the monastery. These are a tribe who are centered around the monastery, and the interdependence between the monastery and the Jebeleya has persisted from the 6th century to this day. And St. Catherine was a uniquely Bedouin town. They are settled, a Bedouin, but they had transhumance. They would go up and down into the mountain, up to the mountains in spring to take their flocks and then come down in the winter. And they depended largely on tourism, for backcountry tourism, and also guiding people up the mountain, Mount Sinai, and for camping in the backcountry. A lot of that tourism had disappeared with the result of the development going on because tourists weren't coming. And also they brought in all the workers from what we call the Nile Delta area, mainland Egypt, about 3,500 to 4,000 workers who have swamped the local community. And because these people have had regular income as opposed to the Bedouin, prices in the shops have gone up because it's quite a distance from anywhere to deliver stuff, food stuff. So the price has gone up. So people are not earning money from tourism. Price has gone up in the shops. But one of the more difficult things to have seen and observed is the fact that in one place, the Bedouin had to dig out their remains of their ancestors and remove them from a cemetery because they were going to put a car park over where their ancestors had been buried. This is against all Islamic tenets of not disturbing the dead. So they're being culturally marginalized, even more so than they've already been, and their means of employment have been reduced. When I was there in 1996 to 2002, there were 3 or 4 hotels there, but they were discreet, much more discreet. They weren't in that corridor of that vista, but not a single Bedouin was employed in those hotels. They're all Egyptians brought in from mainland Egypt, the Nile Delta area. So the prospects of this very large tourism complex, which has been imposed on the landscape, which has been occupied by the Bedouin for 16 centuries, 15 centuries, they had no choice in this. But their landscapes have been colonized, if you like, by this development of little benefit to them. There'll be no employment in those hotels because they bring in waiters and maintenance people from outside. So it is, in a way, it's cultural extinction, and it's a very sad thing to observe. It was very wonderful to hear those familiar voices of Father Justin and Hamid, because these people I knew for a long time.
I can sense your anger when talking about this, John. I don't think that's an exaggeration. If this isn't stopped, what will be lost?
Well, I think, unfortunately, it already has been lost. I think this, if you only have to look at some of the photographs in the BBC report featured last week by Ben Hoffler, who had been there much more recently than I have because he established the Sinai Trail. What is being lost, particularly in the core area, which is the World Heritage Site, is that sense of place, that sense of spirituality, the peace, the beauty of the place, and that extraordinary sense of the historical aspects which have been part of this location, this space, for centuries. They have been lost. The grand vistas have gone. This sense of peace has gone. I believe this huge development has been developed in association with the attempts by the Egyptian government to take control not only of the outlying properties of the monastery, which you may be aware of, but also the monastery itself, and turn St. Catherine into a tourism hub. So basically, they're monetizing what is essentially a spiritual landscape.
That was Dr. John Granger. He's involved in the efforts to stop the Egyptian government's plans to transform one of the world's most sacred sites, Mount Sinai, and the vista from St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at its base, into a mega tourism resort. And Yolande Nell's online piece is well worth a read on this as well. It can be found on the BBC News page. You've been listening to Everyday Ethics, part of the Sunday Sequence programme from the BBC. For more information, go to the BBC website.